We've been at war with Russia for 3.5 years, as you know, but that would just be open war. Why would we go along with that? What is going on?
It's sleepwalking into Armageddon. The TV cameras are all turned on Gaza, which is fine. But the scale of Ukraine and its potential danger is in a whole nother league.
It is, isn't it? Escalating the war at this point, if you're promoting the war at this point, it seems to me your goal is to destroy Europe.
Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones just sat down together to blast continued U.S. support for Ukraine. Why is the U.S. still aiding Zelensky under the Trump administration 9 months into it? And in this clip, the two get into the worst ramifications of that proxy war with Russia and nuclear power, including some not everyone seems to talk about. So let's get right into it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Everyone's been focused on Israel, Gaza, the huge debate about Israel and the United States, which is great, fine. But we sort of are ignoring other things that are happening here and abroad as we have that debate. And one of the things that seems to be happening that fewer Americans are aware of is the situation in Russia seems to be getting between Russia and Ukraine and the United States and Europe, NATO, seems to be degrading quickly. Where is that going, do you think?
It's an extreme escalatory phase, 3.5+ years in. As you know, Trump says he's strongly considering giving them long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles. And Russia has said that escalates into direct war, and they're basically calling it World War IV. The CIA called the Cold War World War III. So we are really in with all the ingredients we have with China, the North Korean troops being in Ukraine, all the different proxy countries involved. This is really a new world war. The only question is, will it continue to escalate, which it is now. And in the next phase, we know that NATO has already been caught with Zelensky with Ukraine 2 years ago shooting missiles into Poland. They tried to blame on Russia. There's been those drones that they claim came out of Russia, but Russia says was basically a setup. A few months ago, you have Operation Spiderweb 3 months ago with smuggled drones as far as 4,000 miles away from Ukraine in Russia on its coast with Japan, with their Bear bombers being blown up, part of their nuclear triad. So imagine if that happened in America, and imagine if Russia had given Mexico the drones to do it. So all of this is NATO trying to suck the United States directly into full conflict. They've got a 250,000-person army, conscription starting up in parts of Europe, a descendant of, quote, peacekeeping force to Ukraine, really calling an invasion force
Yeah, I mean, the Poles have lost a lot of people in Ukraine. This is a fair point. That missile that struck Poland that they tried to blame on the Russians came from Ukraine, and ostensibly under the NATO treaty, Article 5 says, hey, NATO powers that are hit, have the impetus to react. They did in that case. I don't really agree that there's been major escalations of this conflict under Trump. There have been some. The Ukrainians tried to take out the Russian nuclear bombers in an operation they said, took 18 months to construct, and supposedly the U.S. knew nothing about it. I don't really buy that. That's a provocative step. But at the same time, it's just been a constant flow of weapons and intelligence into Ukraine outside of that 6-day period or whatever, in I think late February or early March when the two got into that scuffle. And then Trump's right back on board after that minerals deal that was preposterous, and relied on minerals that are in Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine in the east anyways. But look, this is a facade. Trump said he would end this war, and he's not willing to give up what it takes, and it's going to take an end to U.S. aid to Ukraine. Pull it all out now. Trump won't do it, and that's why a lot of his base is upset about this. And it's going to continue as the military-industrial complex continues to wield influence over Trump and this administration, which is filled with a lot of neocons like Marco Rubio, by the way.
Peacekeeping force. And then now, as I predicted, it was the next move. NATO claims that Russia is going into the 0 phase or 0 hour, and that NATO's now putting out propaganda the last 48 hours that Russia has pre-positioned undercover Spetsnaz special forces all over Europe preparing terror attacks and mass casualty events, and that Russia is preparing to attack Europe proper, which of course is completely insane to do that offensively. And so that fits the pattern of the preparation for false flags that will then be blamed on Russia as the pretext to invoke the articles in NATO that brings NATO directly into war.
That's my biggest fear, by the way. A false flag attack set up by the NATO powers / US, blaming Russia on something that isn't Russia's fault to draw us more deeply into this than we are. And by the way, that's always the threat in the Middle East, too, that, there'll be a false flag attack blamed on the Iranian regime, especially as a new pretext to enact regime change there. I think that's a very fair point. It's one of the biggest reasons why the U.S. needs to just get out of there, remove all the troops and resources from those areas. Make sure that Ukraine is neutral. Don't allow them into NATO. Be very upfront and open about that fact, and just shut down the aid. Zelensky would have to take a piece at that point. And none of this proxy war where we're just giving the weapons to Europeans, and then the Europeans give them to Ukraine anyways to fight the Russians. Because then guess what? We're still in a proxy war with a nuclear power, and it's not worth it.
The United States is still part of NATO. That will drag us directly into war with Russia that will quickly escalate into thermonuclear war in every major war game there is. That's why I agree with Elon Musk and Senator Lee that it's time for us to get out of NATO.
Immediately. If you take 3 steps back, so Europe has no reason to fight Russia at all. Europe has every reason to cooperate with Russia, at least on energy, but on a lot of things probably. It refuses. Russia's now formed an alliance, probably permanent, with China. And so, and Ukraine, of course, can't win. They don't have the manpower. They never could. So if you're escalating the war at this point, if you're promoting the war at this point, it seems to me your goal is to destroy Europe. And I think that's kind of always been the goal, to destroy Europe and the United States.
Yeah, I think Tucker made the best point so far about what this war has done. It's only driven Russia into the arms of the Chinese and solidified that alliance with BRICS. And by the way, guess what else hasn't helped with that? The U.S. intervention in Syria, also a BRICS country, and U.S. intervention in Iran, also a BRICS country. The U.S. is literally doing everything it can to solidify and galvanize BRICS, and that is a senseless thing to do. Nixon had tons of problems, but one of the best exploits of the Nixon administration in terms of foreign policy was taking Russia out of the hands of the Soviet Union. And there was a schism that developed between the two countries before, there were relations normalized with China, but that at the same time, Nixon essentially got China to be a normalized trade partner with the United States and broke apart any potential alliance between the two. And that is the exact reverse course that the U.S. is embarking on now. And Venezuela flirting with regime change there as Venezuela hopes to become a BRICS country too. It's not something we want to deal with geopolitically and financially, as there's a possibility of a new currency emerging that eventually becomes the world reserve currency because these countries don't want to deal in dollars anymore. That would be a serious threat to the fortitude of the U.S. economy outside of the inflation that already takes place because of the central bank.
Well, as you stated, it has been the policy in the United States since the 50s, right through Nixon, right through Reagan, right through Herbert Walker Bush, right until just the last 5 years or so, to split China from Russia.
Of course.
And that is a very good policy. And you have China that is actually expanding all over the South China Sea, just cut off 95% of rare earth minerals to the world, including the U.S. Serious act of war, absolutely vital in everything we do. For folks that don't know,
not an act of war whatsoever. This is antagonizing China in the same way that the liberal establishment wanted to antagonize Russia. I'm not on this China hawk train whatsoever. I'm totally with Jeffrey Sachs on that. And the lessons that conservatives supposedly learned in Ukraine should not be just directly applied to the Eastern theater to create a new proxy war against China over, say, Taiwan. That's not something that I want.
Thing works, cell phones, computers, avionics and aircraft, everything, satellites is based on those. That's another question. How is China allowed to position itself for 95% plus control of rare earth minerals? That's a serious act of war. So their expansion is taking islands in the Philippines, taking drilling rigs, off the coast of Vietnam. All that's happening. They just put a communist government or trying to fully in South Korea. So China is on the move, and everything should be focused on them. It is a strategic blunder of biblical proportions to be roped into the Soros-NATO war.
I'm sorry, you're going to be roped into a war versus China if you're saying that their intervention into South Korea, which there isn't, a military intervention into South Korea, is mimicking exactly what panned out in the early 50s when, to stop communism, we had to send, 50, 60,000 troops there. to stop it, and that was worth it. No, the U.S. is still occupying South Korea for no reason, and it's not in our interest. This is an entangling alliance, just as the entangling alliance with Israel and Ukraine. It's wrong-headed. And, to drum up this threat of China just to replace the Russian threat is so counterintuitive if you're a non-interventionist. I totally disagree with this mentality, but it is prevalent on the American right to just, substitute the hatred of Russia for the hatred toward China.
But NATO and the EU Unelected Commission has said for years that Europe's demographics and finances are the worst of any first world nation or sector. And so they say their business model is a 20 to 30-year war, conventional with Russia, that they believe will allow them to stay on a war economy and will finally break Russia, and then they will break Russia into 5 parts. That's official EU Commission policy. It's totally delusional. Russia's outproducing weapons 3-1, has 3 times the troops in the field and only gearing up. And so in the face of that delusional plan, similar to Napoleon's or Hitler's with Operation Barbarossa in 42, Europe is trying to double down again and sucking us in. But when all the real strategists and even all their think tanks say this wouldn't work, then the question is, why is the Unelected Commission and the U.S. neocons and left fully supporting this commitment to total war?
Because they want to destroy Christian civilization. That's why.
Yes,
it's why they got behind the First and Second World Wars, and it's why the lesson they taught us in school was that it's dangerous to have a big white Christian country, which is not, actually. And they've systematically tried to destroy those countries, and they've succeeded.
And Russia is a very Christian nation, very pro-Western, and the left hates that. And so...
But, okay, so this is not principled opposition to war itself or an embrace of, good non-interventionist ideas that we talk about on this channel. It's just a desire to shift militaristic interests and militaristic resources and military campaigns from Russia toward China. That's not something I want to be a part of, that doesn't learn from the mistakes of the past and getting embroiled in these tensions with nuclear powers. Why would you want that? It's not the kind of situation that we want. We want non-intervention. Don't rattle sabers with these powers. Trade with them and engage in diplomacy for once. It's something that you never do. You always default to war, and conservatives haven't always learned that lesson. I think we're seeing that from listening to Alex Jones here.
Now, they exactly, how do they turn over the chessboard when the Hollywood satanic globalist BlackRock elite are failing? Is you kamikaze the Russians and America and Europe into a giant climactic war while the globalists sit back and watch us all kill each other.
That's totally right. I think that's totally right. Why are we participating in it? Why would the U.S. government ever send long-range missiles? Why would basically, if we send those munitions to Ukraine, we're at open war. We've been at war with Russia for 3.5 years, as you know, but that would just be open war. Why would we go along with that? What is going on?
It's sleepwalking into Armageddon. Well, Europe's demographics and financial system means the unelected EU will collapse in the next few years. It's politically unpopular. So the political reason is they believe a war will keep them in power, and it's delusional. That's the last refuge of tyrants when they're falling, is to take the country to war to try to maintain domestic control.
I think there is something to that, actually, with Keir Starmer and Macron and Mayors being unpopular, and the EU saber rattlers with Russia actually losing a lot of support with populist movements that are rising up to displace them. I think they will be displaced, and I think there's something to this argument, actually.
But again, at a spiritual level, it's absolute Satanism. It's absolute death cult, death wish, that if the globalists can't maintain control, they'll just drag us into the grave of history with themselves. And like so many tyrannies, they are going like the elephant graveyard or boneyard to Russia to die.
Why would the U.S. government continue to recognize Zelensky, who's an unelected dictator who's worked for years to destroy Christianity in Ukraine, which is a Christian country and has always been? Why would he be invited to the White House this week? I don't understand. When he does not have a Democratic mandate. He's not an elected leader. He's a murderer. They've sold our weapons to some of the worst terror groups in the world, and we're treating him like he's a head of state. Like, why are we doing that?
And just 3 weeks ago, he was back at the White House, and Trump then posted Truth Social. And I love Trump overall, but Trump started doing a 180 from saying we need to get out of this to saying, well, we're out of it, but we'll sell whatever weapons to Europe you want. And I feel like Ukraine's going to win, and maybe not just get back its territory, but get more territory, meaning Russia, which is an extremely provocative and escalatory statement to Russia.
Yeah, it's because Ukraine serves as the eastern front of U.S. empire building right now. That this is a chessboard to the U.S. war makers using the Ukrainian civilians to bear the brunt of this bloodshed, this death and catastrophe for dreams of bellicosity against Russia. It's an empire building scheme. That's why he can't get away from it. And Tucker's right, he is a dictator. You know, he's ushered in martial law, he's banned oppositional political parties, shut down Eastern Orthodox churches, banned adversarial media toward him. Hasn't held an election, you know, cites a clause in their constitution, but what kind of corner are you backed into morally when you're saying, hey, we can never have election again? You know, and I'm just going to seize and maintain the reins of power. The U.S. had elections during the Civil War and World War II. It's just so absurd.
And we know that Putin agreed actually to the framework of what Trump wanted, but Zelensky and NATO have refused. And so we have to ask the calculus of why the president, who's, you know, Mr. Peace Prize, has done a great job helping in 7 other conflicts, which I totally support. Why is he suddenly changing course? Tucker, you know him a lot better than I do.
Why the attraction to Zelensky? Why does our foreign policy class or donor class have this fixation on Zelensky? He's a hero. By the way, I've tried to interview him like 20 times. He refused to do an interview with me, but he's, you know, everywhere in the United States, basically American at this point. What's the appeal there?
I think it's the money laundering appeal and the fact that that's where most of the money laundering's still able to go on.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. $200 billion has gone to Ukraine, but in the process, it lines the pockets of Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman, all the manufacturers that sought a new money laundering project in terms of foreign policy after Afghanistan was done. Because after the 20-year occupation of Afghanistan, and mostly in Iraq, there's still 1,000 troops there. But once most of that honey well dried up, they wanted something new. And what could be more lucrative than those? Hey, an endless proxy war, but this time it's against a nuclear power with far greater stakes and fanning the flames with nuclear war this time. That's what they're doing.
Since Trump and Doge and Elon shut down a lot of the graft and USAID and the EPA and Department of Energy, that clearly that is a place where they can launder money and where they can, go over there and be like rock stars in Kiev and have all the prostitutes, the rest of it. Reportedly, it's Sodom and Gomorrah over there. The women, are just partying. All the men, boys and old men go off to die. It's a very, very sick situation. And just the height of decadence. We've heard the quote of Marie Antoinette, which they never proved she said it, where they're about to storm the Bastille at the start of the French Revolution. And they say the peasants are all starving. They're begging for grain. They're begging for wheat. And she says, let them eat cake. And then you saw what happened. Well, this is literally let them eat cake while our country's infrastructure falls apart, while millions die from fentanyl, while crime is rampant in the streets. We have all this money being sent over to Ukraine. And look, I don't like sending money to Israel. I'm not anti-Israel in general. I'm not against the existence of Israel. But that sucks all the oxygen out of the room. And all people talk about is the 50,000 dead Gazans in October 7th, where clearly Netanyahu stood down. That should be investigated. But what about the million plus conservatively dead in and around Ukraine? And what about its potential and now probability on the current trajectory of escalation to lead into full world war and nuclear war? That to me is why it's absolutely the front and center issue. And, the TV cameras are all turned on Gaza, which is fine. But the scale of Ukraine and its potential danger is in a whole nother league.
It is, isn't it? That's my sense. Why is no one saying that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair argument. The scale of this is far more risk-inducing for the United States. This is a war versus a nuclear power, and you can call it a proxy war, but we know the stakes involved. We know the players involved. If Trump's going to send Tomahawks, something, by the way, that won't alter the battlefield conditions as Russia holds something like 20% total of Ukraine territory, I think something like 90% of the Donbass provinces, it's not going to change the situation on the battlefield, but could be viewed as a provocative step by Russia. So for Trump to talk so endlessly during his campaign about, ending this war in 24 hours and, hey, I can talk to Putin, talk him out of this thing, Trump was never willing to do that. He was never willing to give up what it takes, and it's going to take giving up U.S. aid. And the solution isn't just creating a new layer to this proxy war by selling the weapons to Europe first, to then go to Ukraine, to then fight Russia, because then we're still at the throats of Russia. We're still probably going to have a sanctions regime. We're still not going to be on good diplomatic terms. We're not going to trade with the Russians. When everything leads us to believe that that's a better course than just going to war with nuclear powers. The same would be the case with China. So, I'm really down on Alex Jones's opinion on China provoking acts of war. China hasn't even invaded a country in my entire lifetime. This is the same propaganda they used on the liberal establishment side to aid Zelensky endlessly, and now on the, establishment Republican side. That's always been the case. Mike Johnson's whipped for it endlessly. So I want to see what Congress does. If Congress is willing to send more money to Ukraine, that will be telling. We know the Preston is there with Mike Johnson supporting it, with people like Ted Cruz not only supporting it, but boasting about it and how necessary it was. Marco Rubio doing that same thing. There's plenty of people in this administration and close loyalists of Trump that have that record. But the American people don't want that record. And Alex rightly pointed out that this is a warped sense of priorities. When there's crises in the United States to solve, it doesn't even get to the most of them in my mind, which is inflation, the high rising cost of goods, which they say is low, but the CPI can't possibly, prove that, because the CPI doesn't take in some of the most inflationary markets into account with its calculations. And, college tuition being so ridiculously expensive, the compounding of debt and spending by Republicans when we were supposed to have a Department of Government Efficiency designed to cut spending. Well, we have more spending now, and, the $2 trillion in projected Doge cuts were nothing but that. That's what we're dealing with now. So no more aid should go to Ukraine. This is not our war. This is an entangling alliance, and NATO is exactly that. I'm all for pulling out of NATO completely. It served its purpose, if it even had one, and I wouldn't have even supported it during the Cold War. So this is the exact entangling alliance that the founders warned about when they said you're going to inherit all of the enemies of your supposed allies. Ukraine is not our ally. It's our chessboard for empire building. And I don't include myself in saying R as being complicit in it. I mean my criminal government for being complicit with it. But I do want to hear from you. Is Tucker and Alex right about this? What do you think about the reasons why the U.S. continues to fund Ukraine? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Tucker Carlson. Thanks for this interview, Tucker. There were obviously some things I disagreed with with Alex. Some I didn't, but there you go. If you like this video and my commentary, please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support the channel. That'd mean the world to me. And if you do that, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.